welcome to this week's episode of the Goodrum Show with me, Chris Goodrum. As per usual, a big thank you to everybody that watched last week's episode of the show, liked, commented, all that kind of stuff. I think I have some comments that I haven't kind of caught up with yet, so bear with me, and I'll catch up with them as soon as I'm able to do so. Last week's episode of the show, went down quite well, I think. I certainly got a like from the distillery, from Distillery or Distiller Arius Atcha. Made no comment about the possibility that the older spirits were not maybe their own, so I'm guessing that mystery is just going to have to sort of stay unsolved. But anyway, certainly no mystery about what the distillery we're looking at today. Again, another new distillery. Well, I say new distillery. It was new once upon a time. I mean, it started production in 2014. It's just taken me quite a number of years to actually get a selection of samples together to do an episode of the show. Obviously, we're looking at Ardnamurchan. And I did think about over the years about sort of, doing a sort of roundup kind of episode, as I often have a tendency to do, and shoehorn one in. But it just always in the back of my mind was I really wanted to do an entire episode on the distillery. So I had to be patient and wait for them to release enough stuff, or enough stuff that I could get samples of. And so a big thank you to the distillery and to Graham Mackay at Ardnamurchan for most of the samples for today's episode of the show, including, as you probably have noticed from the title picture, some new make. And I mean, that's a really big thank you to Graham for sorting that one out. Obviously, part of the enjoyment of doing these kind of episodes of the show is having the opportunity to taste the new make spirit, and you kind of then can taste all the other samples against each other, and you obviously the new make gives you the sort of benchmark characteristics of the spirit, and you see how, if you can pick them out in the other bottlings, and how it's progressing and all that kind of stuff. So obviously it's not an option that a lot of you guys would have the opportunity to do so, but if you can get your hands on any particular distillery's new make, is always a good fun thing to do. So anyway, let's chat a little bit about the distillery. I think the distillery itself, obviously being modern, it's the archetypal modern distillery. It's kind of built in an eco-friendly kind of manner, and I imagine, although it doesn't actually make a huge amount of fuss about the eco credentials like some distilleries do. I mean, I imagine that nowadays, if you're going to try and get planning permission from a distillery, it's pretty much got to sort of tick all the ecological boxes, and certainly Ardnamurchan does that. It has a hydroelectric generator on site in the river to provide not only cooling water but power as well. It has a biomass boiler using wood chips from the local forest to provide hot water. The draff heads to local herds for food, and the pot ale is used for fertiliser. Again, it's another field to bottle. I hate that term. It really is a horrible term, isn't it? So I'm not going to use it. So forget that I said that. So again, local barley. I believe the farm, Broom Hall Farm, is owned by one of the owners. It is just an archetypal modern distillery. It's a pretty distillery as well, nice and whitewashed, and nice pretty little buildings. A nod to Charles Doig with the pagoda roofs, which I imagine are purely there for show, because as far as I'm aware they don't malt their own barley. But it's a lovely looking distillery. I mean, it's out in the middle of the Ardnamurchan Peninsula, which is sort of out west basically, I believe. And so yeah, it's been a while since I've managed to sort of get all these samples together. Like I said, the distillery was founded by Alex Bruce, the owner of Adelphi Bottlers, and again it was the sort of the classic sort of current reason for building a distillery, and that was that sort of, you know, getting hold of casks was becoming harder, getting hold of quality casks was becoming harder and harder. So, you know, a lot of the independents it's either you buy a distillery or you build a distillery, really. And I guess sort of distillery sales are not sort of, you know, everybody's trying to hang on to their distilleries, so, you know, it's a case of, well, let's build a new distillery and build it in the middle of bloody nowhere, you know. So yeah, like I said, came on stream in 2014. I think the first time I encountered it was probably about 2017, I think, something like that. 2018, when the first commercial bottling was done. I mean, partly it was a case of, when Graham moved from sort of Morrison Distillers to Ardnamurchan, I kind of got a phone call from him saying, I'm now working for this new distillery, are you interested? And this is often how these things have a tendency to happen. You know, sometimes I hear about new distilleries popping up because, you know, people have, you know, moved from another job, you know, one job to another, and I've, you know, obviously dealt with them, and sometimes, you know, you don't hear about these new distilleries for the same kind of reasons. But anyway, so the distillery itself, fairly, like I said, traditional looking, you know, pretty distillery, 2 stills, quite a long wort fermentation, 70 to 120 hours. So we're expecting the new make to be in that sort of fruity kind of style. I mean, as you well know, a lot of the sort of more modern distilleries like sort of Lindors and so on and so forth tend to opt for a long wort fermentation to get the estery character sort of straight off the bat, therefore allowing it to be sort of bottled at a younger age. And certainly they've been bottling it, I think, I mean, although I didn't taste any of their sort of pre-whiskey bottlings. I think they were pretty much bottling it from year 1. So it's obviously got to have something going for it if they could get away with doing it like that. What have we got? So we've got 2, obviously, pair of stills, fairly sort of standard stills, spirit still, very traditional, boil ball, you know, all that kind of stuff. So the one interesting part in all of this is their condensers, shell and tube condensers, so obviously modern condensers, but they're actually outside of the building. And I don't know too many distilleries that have that kind of setup. I mean, there obviously are some, but off the top of my head I can't think of one. I mean, obviously there's Dalyuen, but I mean, we're talking Worm Tub, outside the building, aren't we? Is it Dalyuen? I forget now. I'm sure someone will put me right on that, but anyway, so outside the building, yeah, so interesting. So we're kind of looking at a possibly sort of fruity estery wort, so sort of long fermentation, slow distillation, plenty of copper contact, and then quite a quick condensing. I mean, obviously the thing is with shell and tube condensers, to a certain extent, all types of condensers, you can sort of tailor how quickly you want the spirit to condense, or the vapour to condense, I should say, by how cold the water is running through the tube. So being outside of the building is going to make it even colder. So I would imagine, so like I say, sort of slow, plenty of copper contact in the actual distilling itself, and then a fairly quick condensing to sort of like put the brakes on the. So I'm guessing that they're looking for, you know, or attempting to create a new make spirit that's quite fruity, but has a good fullness and good flavour and richness to it. So, you know, I'm really quite looking forward to trying the new make and seeing if that is indeed the case. So, yeah, I don't think there's a great deal else to say. Like I said, if you want to find out some more information about the distillery, then there'll be a link in the box below as per usual. So, I think it's just time to introduce today's one. Right, okay, so like I said, we're going to kick off with the new make. This was distilled in May of 2019 and taken from 30 minutes into the middle cut. I'm guessing therefore that it's about 74-76%, which is where their sort of strength of their new make. I mean, they bottle or they cask, I think it's 63.5 overall. So yeah, this is going to be sort of somewhere in the region of the 74-76%, one would imagine. So looking forward to starting with that. Right, so now, as you're probably well aware, and this is probably something quite intriguing, I had decided to do this episode of the show, and then lo and behold I get an email saying, oh, we're now going to release our first core, you know, sort of single malt, whereas prior to that they'd all been batches, because obviously batch variation, and it always was the intention of the distillery to get to a point where they had enough stock to iron out the batch variations and therefore create a sort of a continuing ongoing core bottling, and I probably should have waited and used that in an episode of the show, but yeah, I couldn't wait any longer. I'd waited for several years to do this episode, so I thought, bugger it, I'm going to do it now. So right, the first whiskey bottling we've been looking at to a certain extent was released in, or certainly in and around May 2021, and it's AD 042103. So released in I'm assuming the 4th of 21, April 2021, and it was batch number 3. Next bottling we'll be looking at was batch number 5. This was AD 0721, and it came my way in September. Moving on to the next bottling, this is AD 102106, so batch number 6 of October of last year, all incidentally bottled at 46.8%, obviously non-coloured, non-chill filtered, as they should be. I mean, why go to all the trouble you're going to go to and then bottle it at 40% and smother it in caramel? Yeah, that's not quite the sort of like the modern way of doing things now, is it? And then we're going to look at 2 very special cask strength bottlings. This was the first of the Paul Launois releases, AD 0421, and apparently there's a release due this year, in actual fact, this month, I believe. So this is, as you well know, I probably forgot to tell you when we were talking about the distillery, that they make 2, an unpeated spirit and a peated spirit, and vat the 2 together. So I think obviously the unpeated spirit has no peat, and funny that, and that the peated spirit is peated to, I believe, 30 parts per million, I think. So a reasonable degree of peat, and all of the batches, this is actually the unpeated, I don't know if I mentioned the unpeated new make, obviously all the batches are generally speaking a 50-50 split, peated and unpeated, and 65% American oak, 35% sherry, I believe. But the Paul Launois is quite a slightly move away from that. In fact, that it's a vatting of first fill bourbon casks, which were then finished in ex-champagne casks, or 9 ex-champagne casks and 1 ex-bourbon peated cask. So it was kind of like a vatting, basically. So you had the unpeated spirit finished in the champagne, and then they vatted in a cask of peated. So I'm guessing, looking at kind of keeping the peat under control with this particular release and having the emphasis more onto the champagne casks. The last bottling we'll be looking at again, and the Paul Launois was bottled at 57.6. Last bottling is the most recently released cask strength release, AD 0222, bottled at 58.7%. Again, a vatting of a number of different casks, 50 I believe, of which 40 of those were, or 45 possibly, were peated ex-American oak, and 5 or 10, I don't know exactly, were sherry hogsheads. So kind of going the opposite direction to the Paul Launois bottling, dialing up the peat, so we're expecting more peat intensity. And this is the wonderful thing, I guess, when you have a distillery that can produce, you know, different style, different peating levels. You can then blend them together at different proportions to essentially create whatever it is that you want to kind of create. And where the sort of standard bottling is pretty much a 50-50 split, you can indeed sort of create sort of limited releases, small batches, that kind of stuff, with a completely different flavour profile, relatively speaking. So kind of really looking forward to this tasting. I mean, like a lot of distilleries, I've tasted obviously all of these over the course of time, but obviously in isolation to each other, so it's the first time I've had the opportunity to taste everything together, and so yeah, really quite looking forward to that. So enough waffle, and I think time to start off with a bit of new make. Okay, so let's kick off with said new make. Let's see what nose gives us on this end, shall we? Really, really clean. Not as estery as I was expecting. Certainly it doesn't have that kind of bubblegummy white fruit kind of thing happening. It's more barley focused. There's a touch of earth, some honeysuckle. There is some white fruit, pear, touch of strawberry as well. Raspberry, little bit of rose petal, touch of caster sugar. I mean, this is really complex. I mean, no faintiness, no heavy oils. I mean, it's obviously, again, been designed to be clean and crisp and fresh, and although not in the overt estery fruity category, certainly it's from this nosing you're thinking, yep, okay, I can see how you can get away with using this quickly, because there's very little of the, you know, sulfur impurities, and that is a lovely nose. A little bit of a slight soapy note there, and a little bit of tobacco, so we're not talking sort of completely yeah, it's not like it's going to need some time in the cask, you know, just to remove those few impurities. But I can see why they were bottling this at 1 year of age. Anyway, sort the pass on. Whoa, that's a bit of an alcohol kick. Right, so quite citric, quite fresh, again cereally, a little bit of white fruit. Oh, that alcohol is really intense, and it's really giving an impression of spice. It's almost making my tongue tingle, my mouth is watering uncontrollably. Oh, it's got a lovely fruitiness. Again, I'm getting that little bit of pear drop, a little bit of raspberry, strawberry, rose petal, really clean, really fresh. I mean, oh, I mean, that is lovely. That really is a lovely new make. So let's stick a little drop of water with it and see what, bringing it down a few percentage points. Okay, so I'm getting a little bit more fern now, sort of a little bit more herbal notes, tobacco leaf. Sweetened the barley a little bit, maybe not quite so crisp now, not quite so citric, but you know, still very barley centric, very clean, and very lovely, it has to be said. Let's see what the pass I know. Again, sweeter, a little bit more malt, slightly biscuity malt character coming through. Touch of bitterness right on the finish, a little bit of almost licoricey bitterness. Again, the alcohol gives an impression of spice, and it's again clean, but still, but a little bit more malty, a little bit more barleyed, a little bit more denser. Less of, I'm not really getting so much of the raspberry and the sort of like the rose petal on the palate now, but I think that's a really intriguing new make. Okay, so let's move on to the first of the bottlings. This is the AD 0421 batch number 3. Let's see what the note gives us on this then, shall we? Right, so elegant, barleyed. Sherry note is quite obvious. It's got that kind of boiled sweet kind of sherry note. Apricot, pineapple, some lovely vanilla ice cream. Not hugely peated. I mean, there is a little bit of a stringent peat right there in the background, but it's really quite well balanced. Certainly we're looking at the at sort of, you know, the emphasis being on the barley, on the fruit, with a just sort of a balancing amount, a little bit of an influence from the oak and a little bit of influence from the peat. All round, really quite impressed. Let's see what the palate's on. That kicks off with the barley, the fruit, sort of unsweetened pineapple, apricot, apple. Peat is more noticeable, really kind of comes through quite intensely on the mid palate. Slightly astringent, tarry, but sweet as well. Getting that little bit of rose petal, youthful rose petal note that I discovered on the new make. Again, pleasantly spiced, subtle vanilla, subtle dried fruit, so the oak is sitting back and playing second fiddle to the character of the spirit, which is just how it should be. Lovely aftertaste, kind of dusty peat kind of aftertaste, really beautiful balance. That is just yeah, just a lovely whiskey. So let's move on to batch 5. Let's see if there's any discernible difference between the two. A very similar nose, it has to be said. We are again in the sort of barley, fruity end of the spectrum. Not getting quite so much pineapple. It's got a more fleshier kind of character, a bit more banana. Again, boiled sweet sherry note. Again, very subtle vanilla, subtle peat. So, not a million miles away from a little bit subtler, possibly. There's a little less rawness maybe there. Not that it's a sort of like you know, the previous bottling had an unattractive rawness, but it had a. Now, when you sort of go back to that one from this one, you can see where it's got that slightly more sort of youthful edge to it. Nice earthiness there. I just got a hit of sort of almost like pure soil. Yeah, let's see what the pass like. Less peat influence, that's the first thing I pick up on batch number 5. Fruitier, but obviously barley led, but there's more fruit notes there. There is that almost estery kind of note coming through, that sort of pineapple, banana, white fruit. Very mineral finish. It is a lot, or feels a lot less peated than the previous batch, although we're obviously, again, well, I'm assuming, as far as I'm aware, it is a 50-50 split between the two, but it certainly seems that the peat is less intense. It's a lot softer. There's still an earthiness there, but that doesn't quite have that sort of intensity that batch number 3 had with the peat. But again, it's a lovely whiskey, and just goes to show, doesn't it, how one batch can be quite significantly different from the next. Right, okay, let's move on to batch number 6. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Now this feels younger than the 2 previous batches. I'm certainly getting more of that kind of rose petal Turkish delight. A little bit of, and again, more malt as well. Less fruit, more malt. It's got that sort of biscuity, malty sort of character. A touch of almost manure. Again, subtle on the peat, but there is that sort of slight sort of manure-y peat character going on here. A little bit more oak tannin as well, which is quite intriguing. I mean, it feels, like I said, it feels a lot younger than the other two batches, and yet I'm getting a little bit more oak character. Admittedly, it's more oak tannin rather than vanillins. So again, it could have, you know, a bearing on. Maybe this is more of the European oak coming through, but not so much of the sort of sherried influence, but more of the European tannins possibly. So again, quite significantly different to the previous couple of batches. Let's see what the palate's on. Yeah, that feels a lot younger, certainly on the palate as well. Oak is more grippy, it's more tannin, it's tighter. There's a lot more peat from the word go. Again, earthy peat. A little bit of fruit, a little bit of apricot, but the fruit is kind of sitting back and it's kind of playing second fiddle really here to the peat and to the oak tannin. So again, we've kind of got a real about turn. And this is again a wonderful thing about the sort of like, you know, batch variation, deliberate batch variation, one would imagine. I mean, I guess from the word go that Alex Bruce, the owner, head blender, had a kind of a game plan in his mind for how he wanted the spirit, and obviously, you know, working with what he had, and I can see the point about, you know, the fact they were searching for this kind of continuous identity, but because of the stocks they were working with and what have you, that probably wasn't going to happen for quite some time. And they've obviously now got to the point where they've got more consistency, I guess. I mean, you know, with the best will in the world, and probably, you know, you might have the greatest still man on the face of the planet. You know, when you're breaking in new kit, for example, there's going to be some differences. It is going to take a while to kind of like bed down, and, you know, and it's going to take a while to obviously figure out the nuances of the kit. I'm not saying that, you know, the spirit that first came off the stills was awful, but I'm guessing as you learn how the kit kind of all works together, you know, there is going to be that sort of little bit of trial and error to start off with, and, you know, that's going to feed into this whole batch variation thing. But again, like I said, you know, batch variation should be enjoyed, and this is part of the fun about sort of, you know, younger sort of new distilleries, is just having this kind of difference. You know, it's not going to be all the same from, you know, the word go. So yeah, intriguing. Right, okay, so let's move on to the AD 0421, the Paul Launois. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Right, champagne casks are very, very evident. It's grapey, leesy, winey. It's reminds me of the Moment Prestige from Mac Myra. Obviously, very similar kind of concept. It's again, we're looking more barley focused here. More barley, more white fruit, more apricot. A lot less peat. Again, we're kind of almost back to the style of batch number 3. In that it's kind of obviously primarily fruity. I mean, if you ignore the sort of champagne cask influence, there's a little bit of rose petal, a little bit of earthy peat, possibly becoming a little manurey. But I think overall it's kind of sort of somewhere between batch 3 and what was batch 5, wasn't it? Yes. But with that, obviously, that added sort of leesy, slightly yeasty, champagne-y kind of character. Lovely, beautiful nose. Really very, very impressive. Again, very clean. A little bit of darker fruit kind of coming through now. A little bit of buttered toast as well. And again, maybe sort of like, you know, they've used a few sort of slightly heavier charred casks. I don't know what their char is they go for, whether they do go for sort of different charrings in the casks, or whether they opt to go for the same level of charring for all their casks. Yeah, maybe I'm just sort of picking up something that I hadn't picked up on the other bottlings. But anyway, let's see what pass on. That's got an intensity on the finish. Again, the kind of palate follows the nose. Leesy, winey, champagne notes obviously up first. Slightly estery fruit, a little bit of white fruit, apricot. Peat coming through on the mid palate. Again, earthy peat, touch of rose petal, touch of spice, little mass, little spicy finish. Getting some of that leesy notes kind of coming back at me. Bit of vanilla, bit of butter, bit of charred oak, a bit of fruit. That is a superb whiskey, it has to be said. Absolutely stunning. Love the progression. I mean, that is just amazingly good, it has to be said. And again, for such a relatively young spirit. Anyway, let's see what a little drop of water does. Oh, that's really pulled out the champagne cask notes. Really leesy, really champagne-y. It's also given it a bit more darkness as well, a bit more darker, maltier notes. Again, picked up that on the earlier batch bottlings. I think it was batch number 6, I think, or was it 10? 6. Which had that sort of slightly sort of malty, biscuity kind of note, which I'm now picking up on now. Touch of straw as well, but again, we could be sort of looking at the sort of more of the champagne cask influence. Let's see what the pass one now. Again, very champagne casky, very cask orientated, slightly herbal, lesser peat, more gentler peat, but it's still, the peat has still got herbalness, a sort of an earthiness, almost an astringent note there coming through as well. Quite different, yet same, if you see what I mean. The thread of the similarity between the previous bottlings is definitely there, you can tell that, but there's a subtle change here, the obvious, obviously, which is what you'd hope from you using sort of champagne cask. You'd hope that that would have some kind of influence to make it slightly different, which it does. Really very, very impressive, it has to be said. Lovely. Right, okay, so let's move on to the final bottling of the day, the AD02 22 cask strength bottling, 58.7. Expecting more peat. Let's see if that is indeed the case. Yeah, sort of. I can. Yeah, we're kind of again back to the sort of like batch 3 kind of nose. It has that freshness, that rose petal, youthful intensity. Maybe that's obviously the ABV is kind of giving it that kind of youthful, intense character. A little bit of gritty oak, a little bit. Yeah, overall I would say this has got more peat influence than the other bottlings. Touch of spice, some earth as well. It's a little tight, and so I'm kind of having to work the nose a little bit. It has to be said. I certainly didn't get that sort of that same tightness with the Paul Launois bottling, but it certainly has a bit of tightness to it. Let's see what the parts are. So we're more like kind of batch number 6, richer, fruitier, softer to start off with, and then in comes this intensity of earth in you know, almost astringent dark peat. I mean, that is really quite heavily peated, so yes, I can sort of see the fact that they've obviously shifted the peat levels here for this particular bottling, and making it cask strength as well has certainly kind of like really intensified that peat character. It's not one dimensional, there is certainly some fruit notes there, and a little bit of oak, a little bit of dried fruit, but the obvious influence and intensity is the peat here. Let's put a little drop of water with it and see what that does. Softer, sweeter, more aromatic, slightly more citric. Again, like I said, it has that feeling of batch number 3 on the nose, but possibly a little bit more evolved. A little bit more oak now as well, a little bit more vanilla. It's brought out some more active kind of cask notes. Let's see what the parts are. Yeah. Dials down the peat a little bit, but it's still really quite intense and really quite peaty and earthy. A little bit more oak as well, a little bit more vanilla. Maybe the spirit is a little bit older than it was in batch number 3. I imagine it probably would be. So it's now getting a little bit more oak character coming through, yet it still retains that lovely citric freshness. Overall, really, I love that. I mean, it's gorgeous. That really is very, very impressive, has to be said. Right, okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show. Firstly, a big thank you to the distillery for the samples, or for the bulk of the samples for today's episode of the show. Obviously, very, very much appreciate the new make. And it kind of gives you gives me the grounding, the sort of like, you know, it's the spirit character unfettered, and it obviously, you know, has that beautiful cleanness which allows, although not as fruity and estery as I was expecting, it certainly is clean and fresh, and, you know, can obviously be bottled at a relatively young age. So batch number 3, lovely intensity, quite young, citric, fresh, nice balance, again, sort of fruit, a little bit of peat, bit of oak, obviously young, but, you know, really quite intense. Batch number 5, yeah, again, maybe a little bit more fruit character, certainly sort of carried on the theme, shall we say. Batch number 6, kind of almost kind of going back, certainly with the nose, seemed a lot younger, had that Turkish delight kind of note, but, you know, again, beautifully balanced, and as I said when I was tasting them, certainly an intriguing and interesting to see batch variation, and it shouldn't be sort of denigrated. It should be sort of like embraced, because it's always going to give you something sort of slightly different. The Paul Launois, I mean, that was a stunning whiskey. I mean, that this particular bottling is now going for stupid money on the secondary market, it has to be said, just really nicely balanced. Like I said, there's a new bottling due out this month of the Paul Launois, so it'd be intriguing to see what an extra year in cask has done to it. But it certainly, if it's anything as good as this particular bottling, it will be certainly worthwhile searching out. And the cask strength release, again, they'd obviously designed this to be more heavily peat influenced, and lo, it was more heavily peat influenced. Really intriguing, it has to be said. Again, lovely spirit, beautifully clean, more intense peat. What's not to love about that? So as I said earlier on in the show, the distillery have now got to the point where they are releasing what they call their kind of core bottling. Should be available fairly soon from certain whiskey emporiums, so if you're interested, give me a shout. Until then, not a lot else to say apart from good afternoon and good ramming.